The house stood quietly at the edge of the hill, where the land sloped downward into what used to be a road. Its windows, shuttered but not sealed, faced the emptiness, an overgrown stretch of dirt and gravel that once connected it to the world. But that world had moved. The new road, paved and proud, now curved behind the house, where its back door rarely opened and its walls had no memory. The front, however, remembered. It still held onto a view that no longer existed, staring into a past that no one else looked toward anymore. It had been a good place once. People passed by on foot, children on bicycles, merchants in slow-moving trucks with fresh bread or sacks of flour. The house had heard greetings. It had known footsteps and pauses and laughter caught mid-sentence as someone waved from its porch. But then, like the slow turning of a tide, the town reoriented. New priorities, new plans, new efficiency. The road was redirected. The people followed, and the house, rooted in its foundation and unable to pivot, remained exactly where it had always been, facing away. Most homes would have adapted. A new doorway might be cut, new windows added to welcome the sun from a different angle. But this house had a spine too old for bending. Its structure was firm with age, its orientation etched into every beam. It had been built to watch the morning rise over the fields, to catch the breeze as it drifted down the valley, to listen to footsteps approaching from below. Turning would have meant forgetting. And some things, the house seemed to believe, should not be forgotten. Once a week, an older woman came with a ring of keys in a canvas bag. She walked slowly but not sadly, her steps tracing a route she had walked for years. She never entered from the back, always the front, always the long way up the hill, even when it rained. She'd pause before unlocking the door, sometimes touching the weathered wood of the porch railing, as if checking whether it still remembered her. The house didn't creak in protest. It sighed. It seemed to inhale the presence of the familiar and settle into it, like a coat being draped over tired shoulders. The woman entered without sound. The door never stuck. The hinges never groaned. Inside, time softened. Clocks existed but didn't tick. Nothing in the house tried to correct itself. The rooms inside had their own arrangement of silence, the kind that wasn't empty, but full of paused intentions. A teacup sat on a saucer in the corner cabinet, slightly off-center, as though someone had meant to finish a conversation but never returned to it. A chair angled toward the window had a cushion that had softened unevenly, bearing the memory of a particular posture. Curtains remained tied halfway, not in decoration, but in compromise, letting in just enough light to remember the day without letting it intrude too much. Each object held its place with quiet dignity, not staged, not arranged for visitors. There were no visitors, but positioned as if life had simply paused mid-motion. A coat still hung on a hook near the door, its pockets sagging under the invisible weight of forgotten errands. Photographs lined the mantel, not labeled, not framed extravagantly, but standing as silent witnesses to people no one spoke of anymore. Their faces weren't famous, weren't even remarkable, but they had lived here once, and the house held them. The woman who came each week never touched those things. She dusted around them with the reverence one might show to a shrine. Her movements had the softness of ritual, not obligation. She didn't open drawers. She didn't turn on lights she didn't need. She didn't look for anything. It was as if her presence wasn't meant to change the house, only to acknowledge that it still existed. She walked through the hallway slowly, touching the wall with the back of her hand as if measuring its steadiness. She paused at the bedroom door but never entered. The knob remained cold, untouched, patient. Outside, the world went on. Delivery drones buzzed overhead on the new street, unaware of the structure just yards away that had no digital address. Kids passed on scooters, never looking up the hill. No one asked who lived in the old house, or if anyone did. It was as if in turning away, the house had performed a kind of vanishing act, still physically present but invisible by choice, or by principle. And perhaps that was its quiet rebellion. Not a scream, not a collapse, just a refusal to turn toward what everyone else called the future. It stood where it stood, saw what it had always seen, and waited, not for time to return, but for someone who still remembered which way mattered. There was a tree in the front yard, the kind whose roots had grown outward like fingers splayed in sleep. Its branches stretched unevenly, favoring the direction of the house as though leaning in to listen. It bore no fruit, no flowers, only long strands of dry leaves that rustled even when the air was still. Children who once passed that way had called it the whispering tree, though none of them remembered why. It had simply earned the name over time, as old things do, without ceremony. Beneath that tree, the ground sloped gently downward, ending at what used to be a stone path. Moss had crept over the stones, covering them in velvet green, blurring their edges until they looked more like memories than markers. Somewhere under that moss was a name once carved by a boy with a pocket knife, who had been told not to carve things but did it anyway. The name had faded long ago, not because time erased it, but because no one came to read it. The stones remembered. But they were no longer asked to speak. On some mornings, mist would gather in the yard, not dense, not eerie, but soft, like the air was trying to forget it had to be clear. The fog moved around the house, but never behind it. It clung only to the side that mattered, the one that faced absence. And in that silence, the house looked less like a building and more like a thought someone had stopped thinking halfway through. Not abandoned, just paused indefinitely, waiting for context that would never return. Inside, the old woman would light a small fire, even in summer. She never fed it much, just enough to coax a flicker, to let the scent of warmth settle into the walls for another week. She would sit in the chair nearest the hearth, her back straight, her hands still. Sometimes she'd close her eyes, not to sleep, but to be elsewhere. Her face in those moments looked less like someone remembering, and more like someone being remembered. And the house, in its quiet way, responded. The floorboards shifted, not loudly, but with a rhythm that seemed aware. A single draft moved through the hallway as though drawing in a breath that hadn't been taken in years. Even the dust in the corners seemed to hush, to wait. In those moments, nothing dramatic happened. No revelation, no message. Just presence. Just two old things, a woman and a house, keeping each other company not because they had to, but because no one else could. There were shelves filled with books whose spines had faded unevenly, touched more by time than by hands. Some were curled at the corners, others stiff with disuse, their pages still clinging together like strangers on a crowded train. No titles had been alphabetized. No system had ever governed the collection. They had simply gathered there over the years, arriving in boxes, left behind by visitors, chosen without intention, and never returned to. The house did not ask for them to be read. It only held them, as it did with everything else, quietly, without question. A small desk sat under one of the front windows. On it rested a blotter, yellowed at the edges, and a pen that hadn't held ink in decades. A cracked inkwell stood beside it, half full of hardened blue resin. The drawer was slightly open, revealing nothing but folded paper, blank sheets stacked neatly, as if waiting for words that never arrived. Perhaps someone once wrote letters there, or maybe they only meant to. Either way, the desk remained untouched, like a stage waiting for a monologue that no longer made sense to deliver. Sometimes the woman would stand near the desk, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge, not lingering, not searching. Her presence there felt less like revisiting and more like honoring. She never sat. She never opened the drawer farther than it already was. She would glance at the window, not to look out. There was nothing to see, but to remember that once there had been something worth watching. Her breath would fog the glass briefly, and then disappear, like every other trace of the house's past. The ceiling bore water stains in one room, pale brown like diluted coffee, branching outward in quiet organic shapes. No one had fixed them. There had been no repairman, no scaffolding, no urgency. The stain was not treated as damage, but as a story, something that had happened, something that had stayed. Every mark in the house was like that. Each scratch on the floor, each dent on a door frame, a kind of accidental diary. The house did not preserve itself in pristine condition. It remembered by wearing its history openly. And through all of this, the house never made demands. It didn't resist the passing of years. It didn't mourn its obsolescence. It merely endured, and in that endurance offered a strange kind of hospitality. Not the kind that welcomed guests, but the kind that said, "You may stay if you need to." The woman never overstayed. She came, she touched nothing too firmly, and she left, always through the same front door, always locking it behind her, not to keep anyone out, but to let the silence remain folded neatly inside. In spring, the vines along the east wall would bloom, modestly, reluctantly, as if unsure whether it was still their place to grow. They climbed in quiet spirals, threading themselves through the cracks in the siding, reaching upward but never obstructing the windows. Their blossoms were pale, nearly translucent, and carried no scent. To most, they might seem unremarkable, but to the house, they were loyal. They had not migrated to the newer gardens down the hill. They had stayed, rooted in old soil, responding only to the light the house still chose to face. A bird had built a nest above the porch some years back. It was no longer occupied, but the structure remained. Small, brittle, barely held together by time and dry twigs. The woman never disturbed it. Even when she brushed cobwebs from the eaves or cleared leaves from the steps, she always paused just short of that corner. It wasn't that she expected the bird to return. It was simply that something had once lived there, and that alone was enough to leave it be. Sometimes the wind would rise suddenly, not from the valley behind, but from the front, across the forgotten slope. It would carry nothing but dust and the scent of dry grass, but it always found its way through the smallest cracks. The house breathed it in without resistance. Floorboards would pop softly in acknowledgement. The curtain ties would sway as if remembering how it felt to flutter. And in that brief movement, the house seemed almost awake, not alert, not alive, but quietly attentive. The woman on those days would linger longer. She would open one window, not fully, just a narrow gap, and sit near it. She didn't look out. She simply faced the same direction as the house. Her expression didn't change, and she didn't speak, but something in the air seemed to settle. It was as if the two of them, house and guest, shared a single act of looking backward, of choosing not to be turned. When it was time to leave, she never looked behind her. She descended the hill without glancing back at the windows, the porch, or the door she had locked with familiar care. It wasn't avoidance. It was trust. The house did not need watching. It would still be there, facing the wrong way, seeing what only it could see. That was enough. At night, the house absorbed the dark differently. While other homes glowed gently from within, warm squares of yellow cast onto trimmed lawns, the house on the hill let the dark in fully, as if it belonged there. No lights burned past sundown. No silhouettes moved across curtains. The windows didn't shimmer. They reflected nothing. From a distance, it looked as though the house had fallen asleep centuries ago and simply never bothered to wake. Yet inside, the dark wasn't heavy. It wasn't fearful. It was familiar. The kind of darkness that folds around you like a blanket worn thin with memory. In that space, nothing reached for attention. No ticking clocks, no buzzing appliances, just the gentle presence of air that had been still for so long it knew not to disturb. The walls didn't echo. They listened. There was a mirror in the hallway, oval, cracked at one edge, its surface slightly clouded. No one used it to check their appearance. It was too honest for that. It reflected not how things were, but how long they had been that way. People who caught their image there, even in passing, felt a subtle vertigo, as if they had just glimpsed not themselves, but the version of themselves that might have lived a different life, one that didn't turn away, one that stayed. The attic door was closed, always. Not locked, just untouched. Its frame was dusted weakly, its knob polished by habit, but the stairs behind it had not felt a footstep in decades. Still, the air around it carried a density, as though memories had pooled at the top of the house, waiting, not urgent, not forgotten, just waiting. The house seemed content to leave them there, like boxes kept for someone who might one day return and know what to do with them. And so the house endured. Through seasons, through storms, through the slow erosion of relevance. Its paint peeled gently, its wood darkened with age, but it never sagged. It stood firm in its posture, turned toward what was, unmoved by what now is. The world behind it grew louder, faster, newer, but the house made no adjustments. It faced the past not in grief, but in loyalty. It didn't need to be understood. It didn't need visitors or validation. It needed only one thing, to keep facing the direction it had always known was right. Not because it was useful, not because it was admired, but because it remembered something the rest of the world had chosen to forget. The change, when it came, arrived so quietly that the house almost didn't notice. It began with something as simple as a scent, not the familiar fragrance of dust or old wood or the ghost of hearth smoke, but something lighter, unfamiliar, the faint trace of lavender maybe, or soap. It drifted in as the woman stepped across the threshold one morning, carried in on the fibers of her scarf, caught in the creases of her sleeve. The house, which had long since stopped expecting anything new, paused for the briefest moment, if a house could pause, and held its breath. She moved through the rooms as always, her steps soft, deliberate, unchanged. But something had shifted in her, though even she didn't seem fully aware of it. Her fingers lingered longer on the back of the chair near the fireplace. Her gaze, once still and inward, now flicked briefly toward corners of the ceiling, the edges of rugs, the faint outlines of footprints long faded. Not out of concern, not inspection, but curiosity. And the house, unused to being looked at with wonder, responded in the only way it knew how, by remembering a little more vividly. A photograph on the mantel tilted forward. No breeze had touched it. No one had brushed past. It simply leaned as if nudging itself into view. The woman noticed but didn't touch it. Instead, she stood in front of it for a long time, head slightly tilted, mouth gently closed, not smiling but not untouched either. Her hand twitched once, as though reaching for a memory it hadn't expected to find. Then she stepped back, and the photograph remained as it was, more present than before. Outside, a bird landed on the porch railing. Not a rare bird, not symbolic. Just ordinary and brown, with a clipped chirp and an unceremonious hop. But it stayed longer than birds usually did. It peered inside through the smudged glass, head cocked, then ruffled its feathers and settled in. The woman didn't notice it. Not then. But the house did. And something in its old frame shifted, not structurally, but emotionally, like someone adjusting their posture when they realize they're being seen. She lit the fire, as always, with practiced hands, but this time she added a small piece of birch. The scent curled upward, sharp and clean, mixing with the lavender, mixing with the dust, mixing with something the house hadn't felt in years, anticipation. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was the beginning of a different kind of quiet. Not the stillness of being left behind, but the stillness before something returns. That afternoon she opened a window. Not the usual one, not the narrow slit that let in only a whisper, but a larger one in the sitting room, long sealed by habit rather than need. The latch resisted at first, creaking with the indignation of long disuse, but she didn't force it. She waited, let the weight shift, let the metal remember its purpose, and then, slowly, it gave. A breeze came through, not strong, not insistent, just new. It carried with it the scent of something blooming far off, perhaps too far to name. The curtains stirred as if surprised to feel movement again. The house did not protest. It adjusted. Dust rose gently from the sill, catching the light in soft spirals. The wood in the floor responded with a faint crackle, like waking joints. Somewhere in the walls, a beam shifted its sigh. It was not discomfort. It was release. She sat in the chair nearest the window, the one with fabric faded unevenly by years of filtered sun. Her hands rested on her lap, still, unoccupied. She did not bring a book. She did not bring tea. She simply sat, her eyes open but not focused, her breathing level. Outside, nothing dramatic unfolded. A tree swayed, a cloud passed. A bee moved too quickly to be followed. But she remained, rooted, not to the room, but to the moment. The house, sensing this rare alignment, held its own breath. There had been a time long ago when that room had been used for conversation. The chairs angled toward each other slightly. The table between them bore faint rings from cups set down without coasters. The house remembered voices there. Not many, not loud, but real. And now, after years of only memory, something living had returned to that space. Not words, not laughter, just a presence. A faint knock came from somewhere in the walls. Not supernatural, not menacing, just wood settling, or perhaps acknowledging. The woman looked up just slightly, as if expecting to hear something else. But there was nothing, only the breeze and the weight of time shifting ever so slightly in its seat. She stayed until the sun began to lean westward, casting longer shadows across the floor. Then she rose, closed the window slowly, and ran her hand once along the sill. Not to clean, not to check, but to say something without saying it. The window, newly opened and closed again, seemed to retain the gesture like a held breath. Outside, the bird was gone, but a feather remained on the railing, pale, curved, utterly ordinary, and entirely enough. In the hallway, where the mirror hung just slightly askew, something caught her attention. Not a reflection, not a movement, but a familiarity. As she passed, her step faltered almost imperceptibly. She didn't turn her head, didn't look directly, but her pace slowed, and her hand grazed the wall a moment longer than necessary. The mirror remained quiet, clouded with age, unpolished. Yet something about it hummed softly, not audibly, but in memory. There had once been a photograph beside it. The faint outline of its absence still marked the wall, a square of less faded paint surrounded by years of quiet neglect. The nail remained, tilted slightly downward, undecided. The photograph was gone, removed by someone, sometime. No one remembered when, but the space it left behind still held shape like breath trapped in a bottle. She moved past it, but not without noticing, not without remembering something her mind didn't say aloud. Her hand came to rest briefly on the banister at the foot of the stairs. She didn't climb. She never did. The upper floor had remained untouched for years, not closed off, just respected. Its silence was deeper, heavier. The air grew denser on those steps, as though whatever lived in memory had claimed the space as its own and asked to be left alone. But that day, she lingered longer than usual. Her eyes moved upward, not urgently, not longingly, but with the weight of recognition. The stairs remained exactly as they had always been. Carpet worn thin in the middle, a slight tilt in the fifth step, which once groaned under the foot of someone tall. She exhaled softly, then turned away. Not retreating, just pausing the thought before it could become action. The house, however, noticed. It felt the attention like a fingertip tracing the edge of a closed book, not opening, not reading, but acknowledging the story within. Down the hall, the door to the smallest room had shifted. It hadn't been open earlier, just a few inches now, enough to suggest invitation without insistence. It had once been a study, then a storage room, then nothing. Dust gathered more freely there. Light seldom entered. Yet that day, a narrow blade of sun had found its way through the high window, illuminating the floor in a perfect square. She approached the doorway but did not enter. From where she stood, she could see the edge of a box, plain, cardboard, slightly collapsed on one side. Nothing dramatic, nothing labeled, but unmistakably old. Her eyes rested on it, and in that stillness, something shifted. Not in the room, not in the house, but within her. Like the slow pull of a tide, brushing against a shoreline that thought it had been forgotten. The box was unsealed, its flaps curled outward slightly, as though it had once been opened in a hurry and then forgotten mid-thought. Dust had settled unevenly along its rim, but the interior remained mostly untouched. From the hallway, the woman could just make out the edge of something inside. Fabric, perhaps. Faded blue. Folded. It looked like a shirt, or maybe a curtain, or something that had once been meant to wrap around a body or a window. Soft. Private. She didn't step into the room. Not yet. Her hands remained at her sides, still and loose, but her eyes stayed fixed on the box. The sunlight that had found its way in was beginning to shift, the square on the floor tilting ever so slightly as the afternoon leaned forward. The fabric caught the light briefly, and in that flicker, a faint thread of scent traveled outward. Linen, old paper, the ghost of something once worn often. Behind her, the hallway remained unchanged, but the air in the room had thickened, not unpleasantly, but with a kind of gentle attention, as if the space itself had waited for this moment, not with urgency, but with the patience of someone sitting at the bottom of a letter never sent. The house did not creak. It didn't whisper, but its walls seemed to lean in ever so slightly, listening. She took one step forward. Just one. Her foot rested on the threshold, the wood beneath it softer than she remembered. The edge of the box was now clearer. There were more things inside, a stack of papers, folded unevenly, a cracked leather belt, a pair of reading glasses missing one arm. Nothing organized, nothing precious, just artifacts of presence, the sort of items one leaves behind without realizing they've done so, the sort of things no one ever intends to become evidence. Her breath deepened, not sharp, not caught, just fuller. Her gaze moved across the contents without settling. Her body remained still, but something within her stirred like sediment lifting from the bottom of a jar. She didn't reach for anything. She didn't need to. What was there was not meant to be held again, only witnessed, only acknowledged. The room, small and square, held a quiet dignity. Its corners were filled with shadow, but not menace. The kind of shadow that knew how to make itself small so others could feel safe. She stayed there, in the doorway, long enough for the sunlight to move entirely off the floor and onto the far wall, where it faded into the grain of the wood as if retreating politely. And then she stepped back. Slowly, carefully, without turning her back to the room. She didn't close the door. She didn't need to. The box had already opened more than its flaps. That evening, as the sky outside faded into its quieter colors, lavender, then ash, then the slow ink of dusk, the woman returned to the sitting room. The fire had long since cooled, but the hearth still held the scent of warmth. She didn't relight it. She sat instead in the same chair as earlier, facing the darkened window. This time her reflection barely appeared, just a faint outline in the glass, a soft distortion shaped more by memory than by light. The feather on the porch had vanished, perhaps taken by wind, perhaps simply no longer needed. In its place, a few grains of soil rested on the railing, as though something had landed briefly, then moved on. The house didn't mark the change. It had learned long ago that not all absences were losses. Inside, the quiet grew deeper, not heavier, not sadder, just fuller. The kind of silence that isn't waiting for sound, but becomes its own presence. The air held the faintest chill, but she didn't reach for a blanket. Her hands rested gently on the arms of the chair, unmoving. Her eyes were open, but not focused on anything. It was the kind of gaze that people reserve for places they once loved, now seen from too far away to touch. Upstairs, the closed door at the end of the hallway remained shut, yet something behind it had shifted, not opened, just loosened. The house didn't move, but it remembered differently now. Less like a fortress, more like a photograph that no longer insists on sharpness. The corners softened, the clarity blurred, but the feeling, that stayed. She rose once, briefly, to fill a glass of water. In the kitchen, the faucet stuttered before flowing, as though surprised to be called upon. The pipes hummed low and familiar, like a voice too tired to speak but still willing to respond. She drank without haste, then rinsed the glass and placed it back where it had always belonged, beside a bowl with a chip no one had ever tried to fix. As night settled, she didn't light the hallway lamp. She walked through the darkness as if guided by something older than vision. Her feet knew where the floor curved. Her fingers knew which wall to touch. And when she reached the front door, she stood for a moment, not in hesitation, but in recognition, as though the day, for the first time in a long time, had not simply passed, but meant something. She stepped outside. The wind had died down, leaving the hill in perfect stillness. Behind her, the house did not close itself off. The door remained ajar for a moment longer than usual, as if waiting to be asked a question that hadn't yet formed. And then, gently she turned and closed it, not with finality, not with weight, but with the quiet care one gives to something that has just begun to speak again. That night, the wind shifted again, not in direction, but in tone. It no longer moved with the sharpness of distance, but with the slow roundness of return. It curled around the eaves of the house like a breath drawn in rather than blown out. The branches of the whispering tree stirred only once, then stilled, as if acknowledging something without needing to repeat it. Inside, the air settled differently. The floor didn't creak, the shadows didn't stretch, but the space between objects, the space that usually went unnoticed, seemed to grow more present. The hallway held a softness that hadn't been there before. Even the dust in the corners, long left undisturbed, felt like it had turned slightly, as if listening. In the small room, the box remained untouched. No hand had reached into it. No item had been removed, yet it no longer looked like a forgotten container. It looked like something placed intentionally in waiting. The slant of moonlight that slipped through the narrow window caught the glasses at the top of the pile, casting a reflection that shimmered briefly on the wall. The house didn't make anything of it, but it didn't ignore it either. Upstairs, the door at the end of the hallway seemed to breathe differently. It didn't open, didn't move, but it gave off the feeling of something newly aware. Behind it, the silence was no longer sealed. It felt porous, as though the room had begun to exhale after holding its breath for too long. Nothing came through, nothing asked to, but something, deep and old, began to loosen. The woman did not return that night. Her visits were never predictable. The house had learned not to expect her, only to receive. But somehow, the space she had left behind didn't feel vacant. It felt paused. Her presence still clung to the fabric of the chair, to the imprint of her footfall on the rug, to the cooled rim of the teacup she hadn't used. Not haunting, not lingering, just remaining. The house did not mourn her absence. It waited, but not idly. It waited like something remembering how to wait with purpose. Outside, the slope remained overgrown, the old road barely a suggestion beneath the weeds, but the house still faced it, still chose that direction over all others, not because it could not change, but because something about looking forward no longer felt necessary. What mattered had already happened, and that was enough. And in that stillness, something subtle yet irreversible occurred, not in the wood or the windows, not in the dust or the dark, but in the space between memory and present. The house, once merely enduring, now began to remember, not as an act of holding on, but as an offering. Something had begun, not loudly, not even clearly, but it had begun. When she returned, the light was different. It wasn't brighter, just clearer, like the air had decided to reveal its own texture. The hill was quiet, as always, but not still. The grass along the slope moved in coordinated waves, as if greeting her with a language too old to translate. She carried something this time. A wrapped bundle, modest in size, held with both hands. Not heavy, but important. The house, before even the key turned in the lock, knew she had brought something it hadn't known how to ask for. She entered as always, with quiet steps and familiar pauses. But today, her rhythm changed. She didn't linger at the hallway mirror. She didn't visit the hearth. She walked directly to the small room, the one that had begun to breathe again, and paused at the threshold. The box was still there, unchanged, waiting with its gentle gravity. She didn't look inside. Instead, she placed the bundle on the desk, the same desk no one had touched in years. It settled into the wood with a softness that made no sound, but the air around it seemed to shift. The wrapping was fabric, linen, off-white, worn soft with time. She didn't unwrap it right away. She stood beside it, one hand resting lightly on top, as though transferring warmth or asking permission. The sunlight through the high window found her fingers, casting pale shadows on the surface of the bundle. In that moment, the room seemed to lean in closer. She unwrapped it slowly, deliberately. Not with ceremony, but with care. Layer by layer, the cloth fell away until it revealed something small, framed, and dark. A picture. Or perhaps not a picture. An image, yes, but not one meant for display. Its edges were worn, the glass slightly scratched. She didn't lift it. She didn't show it to the room. She simply looked down at it in silence. The house responded, not with movement, not with creaks or sighs, but with awareness. The air held still around her, as if forming a barrier against interruption. The shadows in the corners stayed where they were. Nothing leaned forward. Nothing fled. It was as though the house understood this was not its moment, but hers. She placed the framed image beside the box, not inside it. The gesture was subtle, but deliberate. This was not a return to the past. This was an addition to it. A continuation. The photograph did not glow, did not weep, did not tell any story. But it settled into the space like a final puzzle piece, one that hadn't been missing, only waiting for the question it answered. She stood there a while longer. No expression on her face, but something in her shoulders softened. When she turned to leave the room, she left the door ajar. Not open, not closed. Just enough for the house to see that something had changed. That night, the house did not settle as quickly. Its floorboards did not sigh into their usual stillness. The air hung differently, not restless, but alert, as if the walls, long content to remember quietly, were now rehearsing the act of being present. The photograph remained on the desk, untouched, unlit, but unmistakably there. And the room that had once been just another sealed chamber of memory now pulsed with something faintly awake. Elsewhere in the house, things began to notice. A clock on the mantel, which hadn't ticked in years, shifted minutely, the hands moving not forward but back, as if retracing a breath. The mirror in the hallway, still hanging at its gentle tilt, caught a different light now. It didn't reflect her. She had already gone, but it did reflect the open doorway behind her, and the soft fabric that had wrapped the frame, now folded on the desk like a memory put down carefully. The stairs, unused for so long, groaned once, just once, as if testing their voice. No one climbed them. No weight disturbed their slumber, yet the creak echoed a moment longer than expected, the sound sliding into the walls and disappearing like something swallowed. The house did not explain. It simply allowed it. In the kitchen, a drawer had shifted open slightly. It hadn't been used in years. Inside were a few spoons, an old envelope, a ring of keys no one remembered needing. The woman hadn't touched it. The house hadn't offered it. But still, the drawer had moved. Just enough to remind itself that it could. Outside, the slope below the house remained silent. No paths had reappeared. No steps disturbed the wild grass. But in the darkness, the outline of the old road, nearly erased by seasons, became faintly visible. The moonlight didn't so much illuminate it as agree to remember it, not for function, just for form. And somewhere deep within the structure, beneath layers of floor and frame, the foundation remembered something long buried. A name once whispered between walls, a footstep pattern so familiar it had shaped the grain of the floorboards. The house didn't try to resurrect it, but it held the memory closer now, nearer the surface, like a stone pushed upward by thawing ground. Nothing spoke. Nothing declared. But the shift had begun. The house, for all its refusal to face the future, was no longer simply looking back. It was beginning to feel time differently, not as a line to be followed, but as a space to be filled. And in that space, the photograph waited. Not for attention, not for recognition, but for integration. The woman had left it there not to be found, but to be accepted. And the house, in its quiet, reverent way, was preparing to do just that. She returned the next morning without her bag. No keys, no scarf, no gesture of arrival. The door had been left unlocked, though neither she nor the house remembered doing so. It didn't matter. The entryway greeted her without sound. She slipped her shoes off quietly, as if entering not a house but a pause in time. She moved more slowly that day. Not from weariness, but from immersion, as though the very act of motion required her to listen first. Her footsteps were deliberate, placed with the kind of attention people usually reserve for sacred spaces. She did not tidy, did not dust, did not check the corners or touch the frames. Instead, she let the house guide her. And the house, for the first time in years, responded not only by holding her, but by making room for her. She stood at the window in the sitting room for a long while. The glass was slightly fogged from the inside, though the air was not cold. Her breath did not mark it. Her hand did not reach to clear it. The outside view remained soft and unreadable. Just the slope, just the trees, just the place where the road used to be. She did not try to focus. She seemed content with the blur. Later, she sat in the small room again, but not in the doorway. This time she stepped in, just a few paces, just far enough to become part of the space, rather than an observer of it. The photograph was still there, beside the box, its position unchanged. She didn't touch it, but her gaze remained fixed, steady, calm. And for the first time, the room felt less like a storage of memory and more like a presence being witnessed. The sun moved across the sky. The shadows shifted along the floor. She remained. Hours passed without announcement. No clock marked them. No bell rang. But time bent itself around her in quiet acknowledgement. She was no longer visiting. She was dwelling. At one point, she stood and wandered into the kitchen. She didn't cook. She didn't open cabinets. But she turned on the faucet and let the water run for a moment, just to hear it, just to feel it. She placed her hands under the stream and then turned it off. No towel, no wiping, just water on skin, drying slowly as she returned to the heart of the house. When dusk arrived, she did not prepare to leave. Instead, she moved toward the staircase, the one she never climbed. She placed her hand on the banister, not as a test, but as a greeting. And then, slowly, she ascended. The wood beneath her feet groaned with memory, but not resistance. Each step she took was echoed not only in sound, but in a sense of invitation. At the top, she paused. The hallway stretched ahead, dim and undemanding. Doors waited along it, closed, but not locked. Behind one of them was a room neither she nor the house had entered in years. And now, it no longer asked to be left alone. The door at the end of the hallway opened without sound. Its hinges, long presumed stiff, moved as though they had been waiting, not unused, but merely patient. The woman didn't hesitate. She stepped inside with the stillness of someone entering a place they had never truly left. The air was undisturbed, yet not stale. It felt as if it had been holding its shape, waiting for her silhouette to complete it. The room was simple. A bed with a wooden frame, a dresser with a missing handle, a lamp, unplugged, with a faded shade tilted just slightly off-center. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The light filtering in through the window hit the walls at the same angle it must have once done daily, painting long, horizontal stripes across the floorboards. But now the light felt slower, heavier, as though it too had waited. She didn't move toward anything. She didn't sit. Her eyes wandered across the room like fingers tracing familiar fabric. They paused on a spot above the bed, a nail, bent slightly downward, holding nothing. A picture had once hung there. Not the one in the small room. Another. She didn't need to remember what it had shown. The absence of it was more articulate than any image. The dresser drawer was ajar, only slightly. She approached it, not out of curiosity, but as one approaches something living. Inside was a single shirt, carefully folded, yellowed at the collar. She didn't touch it. Her hand hovered just above, warm, forgiving. She closed the drawer slowly, not to hide anything, but to let it rest. From the window, the yard looked as it always had from above. The whispering tree, the crooked fence, the invisible path, She watched it all with a softness that had nothing to do with nostalgia. It was not a yearning for the past. It was a recognition of what had endured. She left the room as gently as she had entered. The door remained open behind her, not flung wide, but eased into welcome. The hallway, once a narrow channel of avoidance, now felt wider. The house had opened something, and so had she. That evening, she did something new. She stayed. No return to the city. No gentle goodbye. No glance over the shoulder. She simply remained, like the house had invited her to inhabit not just space, but time. The fire she lit was not symbolic. It was warm, real. The blanket she draped over her shoulders carried the faint scent of the attic, dust and cedar, and years folded into quiet. She made tea without performance. She drank it without thought. Night deepened. Outside, the sky turned the color of ink diluted in memory. The stars were not bright, but they were many. From the porch, she could hear the sound of distant windmills turning lazily. The house held its shape around her, not enclosing, not containing, just accompanying. She slept in the small room, not because it was closest or easiest, but because something in it had asked, and something in her had answered. The photograph on the desk remained untouched, but in the dim light it seemed to hum faintly, like something satisfied by being allowed to exist. She didn't dream. Or if she did, the dreams were so familiar they folded seamlessly into her breath. The bed creaked once when she shifted, and the floorboard beside it replied with a muted echo. The house didn't watch her sleep. It slept beside her. In the early hours, when night had not yet finished, but morning had already begun, she rose and walked barefoot through the hallway. Her steps no longer needed memory to find their way. Each one was placed with the certainty of presence. The open door at the end of the hall, the stairway curve, the quiet space near the hearth, all greeted her like a language she didn't have to translate anymore. She stood at the window as the first light returned. The grass outside was still, the road invisible. But the house had changed. Not in appearance, not in layout, but in posture. It no longer faced the past alone. Now, it faced her too. In the days that followed, the woman remained. She didn't announce her decision, didn't declare a return. But the way she moved through the house made it clear. She belonged, and she had allowed herself to belong. It wasn't about reclaiming or restoring. She changed nothing, but her presence itself became a kind of repair. The routines were simple. She opened the windows every morning, all of them. The house breathed differently then, wider, deeper. A rhythm began to form, not imposed, not scheduled, but organic. Tea in the kitchen, silence in the hallway, a lamp lit at twilight. These things, done with quiet intention, began to shape the hours into something soft and whole. She sat sometimes on the steps of the front porch, a blanket over her knees, watching nothing in particular. Not waiting, not reminiscing, just being. The tree whispered. The wind came and went. A bird nested in the eaves again. In the room upstairs, the dresser drawer remained closed, but the air inside the room no longer felt sealed. It felt shared. The past didn't leave, but it no longer occupied every inch. It made room. On the seventh day, she placed something beside the photograph. A small stone, smooth, dark, unremarkable. A weight, perhaps, or a marker. She didn't explain it, but the desk seemed to understand. That night, as she extinguished the final light, she whispered something into the hallway. Not to the house, not to herself, just to the quiet. And the quiet, long practiced in receiving what was never said, held her words gently and didn't let them fall. By then, the house no longer faced the wrong way. It simply faced what mattered, and the world, in its endless forward motion, curved slightly to make room for them both. The days no longer passed. They unfolded. Each morning came not as a repetition but as a variation. Slight shifts in light, new silences between footsteps, fresh creaks in the boards that didn't feel random anymore. The woman moved through the house as though she had always been there, her rhythm so aligned with the place that even the wind outside seemed to wait for her to rise before beginning its own wanderings. She no longer brought things with her. She no longer needed to. What she required was already here, waiting patiently where she had left it, or perhaps where the house had left it for her. The small room held its stillness differently now. The photograph and the stone beside it had become an arrangement, quiet but certain. The desk seemed slightly less bowed, as though relieved to have purpose again. Sometimes she would pause beside it, not to look, but simply to be near. The house felt this as clearly as breath. It did not watch. It attuned. The walls no longer echoed with the past. They absorbed the present as it was given. In the kitchen, a kettle sat on the stove, no longer moved between uses. It belonged there. The water boiled without surprise, without ceremony. The cups no longer clinked nervously when set down. Even the spoon, when stirred, made a rounder sound. There was no guest, no host, only continuity. The act of living had returned to the house not with noise, but with weight, the soft, certain kind that anchors without binding. Upstairs she opened the windows. One each day, just a little. The attic breathed for the first time in years. Dust moved in spirals, not away, but across, like dancers finding new partners after decades of stillness. Nothing rushed. There was no clearing out, only space, shared more openly now. The ceiling stains, once signs of damage, became familiar landmarks. She noticed them, acknowledged them, and left them alone. They had a right to remain. At night, she left the lamp on longer, not for fear, not for comfort, but for presence. The house glowed from within in a way it hadn't since anyone could remember. Not brightly, just enough to say, "Someone is here." Shadows no longer pooled in corners. They leaned softly against objects, companionable and calm. Time did not move faster. It did not slow. It simply settled into place. The slope outside remained untamed, the path invisible. But that no longer mattered. The house had stopped looking for what was lost. It had begun to hold what was, and in doing so, it no longer felt like it faced the past. It felt like it faced her. The woman had started humming. Not music, not melody, just soft vibrations that carried no tune and no destination. They emerged from her as she moved through the rooms, as natural and unforced as breath. Sometimes they stopped mid-note, unfinished, as if she'd forgotten she was making a sound at all. But the house noticed. The walls absorbed the resonance, held it like sunlight on old wallpaper. The floor creaked more gently in reply, as though offering harmony. There was no performance in this, no intention, only a subtle acknowledgement that silence was no longer the only language spoken here. She spent more time on the porch now, not looking for anything, not measuring time, just watching the movement of air through trees, the way the branches swayed like they were remembering how to nod. The wind didn't pull at her clothes like it used to. It passed over her as if it recognized her as part of the place. Even the birds landed closer now. One perched regularly on the edge of the railing, tilting its head before flying off with no urgency. The porch had stopped being a threshold. It had become part of the inside. Sometimes she would place her hand flat against the doorframe as she passed through it. Not for balance, not out of habit, but like one might greet an old friend without words. The door, once stiff, now swung with quiet dignity. It neither stuck nor slammed. It simply followed her pace. Even the hinges seemed to breathe better. In the afternoons, the light came in with a softness that made shadows stretch slowly, as if reluctant to leave. She didn't chase them away. She moved among them, letting them drape across her shoulders, her back, her hands resting on the arms of chairs that had not been sat in for years. She didn't rearrange furniture. She never asked the space to be different. And because of that, it shifted for her. Subtly, lovingly. The chairs creaked differently. The cushions sighed when touched. The rugs lay flatter, their corners no longer curling. She began leaving doors slightly open, not wide, not closed, just ajar, enough for air to pass through, enough for presence to carry room to room. The house, long composed of compartments and barriers, slowly became continuous again. Rooms that had once forgotten each other now began to share a single quiet. The echo of a kettle boiling in the kitchen reached the upstairs landing. The warmth from the fire traced its way into the hallway. The house was remembering how to be whole. That night, as she sat by the window with a mug in both hands, her reflection caught the edge of the hallway mirror. She didn't turn, but the reflection stayed, held gently between glass and shadow. It was not just her face. It was the shape of belonging. She found it by accident, if accident was still a word that applied in places where time moved like sediment and meaning settled into the floorboards. It was tucked behind a row of books on the lower shelf in the sitting room. Books she had never thought to move, books whose titles no longer had spines legible enough to invite attention. She wasn't looking for anything. Her hand had simply wandered lower than usual, brushing the edges of forgotten covers, and then landed on something that didn't belong. A fabric pouch, soft, tied with an uneven cord, tucked as if it had once been hidden, but not too carefully. She didn't open it immediately. She placed it on the armrest of the chair and sat beside it, her eyes resting on the shape without pressing it to reveal anything. The house grew still again, not with tension, but with curiosity. The room shifted its weight toward her ever so slightly, the kind of shift that happens when someone leans in, not to intrude, but to witness. When she untied the cord, the fabric unfolded with a faint sound, like breath being released. Inside was a small object wrapped in paper browned at the edges, thin, brittle, and so old that it didn't unfold as much as fall open. The thing inside wasn't dramatic, not precious, just a key. Old iron curved at the top with teeth too worn to know what they once fit. It held the weight of something that had waited a long time to be remembered. She turned it over in her hand. It didn't shine. It didn't warm in her palm. It simply was. Her eyes didn't widen. Her mouth didn't move. But her entire body grew quieter, as though the key had asked her to hold her breath. Not in suspense, but in reverence. She didn't rise. She didn't try to fit the key into any door. She just sat there holding it, while the late afternoon light pressed against the window panes and made patterns on the floor. The key knew something, not about entry or locks, but about keeping. It had kept something for someone, maybe for her, maybe for the house, maybe for the version of both that used to exist when the road still curved gently up toward the porch instead of away behind the hill. When she finally placed it on the table beside her, she did so without reluctance. The pouch lay open beside it, the paper folded again, imperfectly. She didn't try to restore it to how she had found it. It wasn't meant to be hidden anymore. The house didn't react with movement or creak, but the air in the room shifted, warmer now, as if a window had opened somewhere she hadn't touched. The key rested in plain sight, not asking for use, not recalling a task, just offering its presence after all this time to someone who understood the gift of leaving some things unanswered. It happened later that evening, when the light had settled into that soft gray stage between presence and absence, when even the trees outside seemed to hold their branches still in quiet anticipation. She was sitting by the fire, the flames low, not for heat but for movement, for the gentle flicker that reminded her the world was not entirely still. The key remained on the table beside her, untouched, unpolished, simply present. She had not spoken aloud all day. There had been no need. The silence between her and the house had grown comfortable, so complete that even her breath seemed to belong more to the air around her than to her own chest. And then it came, not loud, not sudden, but undeniable, a sound from deep within the house, not the groan of wood, not the clatter of something dislodged, not the creak of settling beams. This was softer, lower, something like a sigh, long, drawn, a single exhale from a place with no lungs, a sound that was not mechanical, not atmospheric. It was intimate, as if the house, after holding in breath for years, had finally remembered how to let it go. She didn't startle. She didn't look up immediately. Her body stilled, but not from fear. It was the kind of stillness that greets the sacred, not with awe, but with consent. The sound passed through her like water soaking through cloth, quiet, slow, absolute. She closed her eyes. The fire continued to crackle. The air did not change temperature, but something in the room had become lighter. The sigh did not repeat. It didn't need to. Its singular release had said more than any repetition could. It was not a signal. It was not a warning. It was not a voice. But it had spoken. And what it said was simple. I remember. I am still here. She opened her eyes and looked around, not with urgency, but with recognition. There was nothing visibly different. The walls remained. The lamp still glowed. The cushions held their shapes. But the atmosphere had shifted, like a room after someone forgives you. The kind of shift you don't notice in furniture or lighting, but in how your own body feels when you enter the space again. Something long held had been released, not thrown out, but allowed to rest elsewhere. She rose slowly, walked once through the hallway, past the mirror, past the open doors, and paused at the foot of the stairs. She didn't climb them. She just stood there, listening. The house made no further sounds, but it no longer needed to prove itself. The moment had already arrived. When she returned to the chair, the key remained where she left it, but it seemed somehow heavier now, not in weight, but in role. It was no longer a mystery. It was a witness, like the sigh, like the silence, like her. She stepped outside just before dawn, when the sky was still a question, and the light had not yet decided how to arrive. The air was damp, not with rain, but with the softness that clings to things that have stayed still too long. Her feet touched the wooden porch without hesitation, without shoes. The wood, cool and worn smooth by years of weather and waiting, welcomed her weight with a quiet firmness. Behind her, the door remained open, but not as a gesture. It simply no longer needed to be closed. She stood at the edge of the porch and looked back at the house. Not a glance, a gaze. For the first time in years, she was not seeing it as a place she entered, but as something that existed apart from her, something that had its own memory, its own body, its own long, slow breath. The way the windows reflected nothing, the way the roof dipped slightly in one corner, the way the vines climbed only so far and then stopped. All of it felt less like imperfection and more like biography. She stepped off the porch and into the grass, which was cool and full of dew. The blades bent without breaking under her steps, bending as if they recognized her too. The hill sloped gently, the same as it always had, but her feet found new rhythms in its incline. She didn't go far, just far enough to see the full face of the house. The wrong way, they used to say, facing backward, facing what was. But from where she stood, it didn't look wrong. It looked intentional. It looked like something that had made a choice and stuck to it. The sun began to rise behind her, sending the faintest light across the front of the house. Not dramatically, just enough to outline its shape. And in that first glow, the house didn't seem empty. It didn't seem old. It seemed aware, awake. It wore its cracks and weather stains, not as wounds, but as marks of having endured, as proof of having stayed while everything else moved. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, but something in her chest shifted. Not pain, not joy, just space, space made by recognition, by standing before something you once called a structure and now understand as a companion. She raised her hand, not to wave, not to reach, but simply to respond, to mirror something in the shape of the house that had been waiting for a gesture, not to begin something, but to complete it. The wind picked up slightly, enough to rustle the branches of the whispering tree beside the porch. It wasn't a message. It was a breath, and the house received it without resistance. She returned inside as the light settled fully into the house, not flooding it, not illuminating every corner, but entering with familiarity, touching the walls like someone brushing a shoulder in greeting. The door eased shut behind her, not with weight, but with agreement. The house did not resume its stillness because it had never left it. The quiet that now wrapped around her was no longer the hush of waiting. It was the softness of companionship. The kettle warmed again that morning, its whistle low and brief, like a memory retold not for clarity, but for comfort. She poured the water with steady hands, letting the steam rise across her face, then sat in the small room where the photograph still rested beside the stone. Nothing had been added, nothing had been moved, and yet the entire desk seemed changed, not by touch but by attention. It had learned how to hold presence again. She spent part of the day in the attic, not cleaning, not searching, just being. The floor creaked gently under her weight, but not in protest. The air was still dusty, the boxes still closed. She sat on an old trunk for a while, her hand tracing the grain of the wood, following its patterns like a map of time. There were no memories she needed to recover, just layers of space that welcomed her, simply because she had come. By late afternoon, she was back by the window, the light outside now tilting toward gold. The porch beyond was empty, the hill unchanged. But the house no longer looked outward with longing. It no longer needed to remember a road. It no longer asked what had been lost. It had somehow begun to live. That evening she lit the fire again, not because of cold, but because the sound of it belonged. The crackling filled the spaces between the rooms, between her footsteps, between the beams and the breathing. She sat nearby, a book in her lap, unopened. Reading was no longer the only way to receive stories. The house had become a language. Its walls spoke in warmth and slanting light, in the way the floor knew when to creak and when to stay silent. As night came, she did not turn on every lamp, only one, in the hallway. The mirror caught it gently, casting no reflection, only light. She passed it without looking, because there was no longer a need to check if she was real. Everything that remained around her already proved it. Before bed, she left the door slightly open again, each of them inviting nothing in but letting everything breathe. The key still lay on the table. She did not move it. Some things did not need to be used to fulfill their purpose. And when she finally lay down, the house did not quiet itself for her. It simply continued being, as it had learned to do again, with her, not for her. The rain came without warning, though it had been waiting for a long time. It didn't arrive with drama or wind. It simply began, first as mist on the edges of the windows, then as a soft percussion on the roof, then as the steady rhythm that filled every room with a hum deeper than silence. The woman didn't look up when it started. She was already listening. The house, too, didn't shift or groan or brace. It welcomed the rain like an old habit, like an old friend who never asked to come in, just leaned against the walls and stayed a while. Outside, the hill darkened in color, greens turning to charcoal, paths vanishing into wet grass. The whispering tree moved differently in the rain, not swaying, but trembling, as though its leaves were remembering how it felt to be held by water. The fence soaked in the sound. The earth softened, releasing a scent that had waited underground all winter. The road, still invisible, became a channel for runoff, and yet somehow more visible in that moment than ever. Not in form, but in memory. Inside, the rain became a second ceiling. Every surface of the house seemed to lean upward, catching the cadence, echoing it downward into the bones of the rooms. The windows fogged slowly. The corners darkened. The fire remained lit, not out of need, but because its warmth became the center around which sound and space began to orbit. The kettle steamed a little longer than usual. The floors cooled. The rugs deepened in color. She moved slowly that day, and the next, and the ones that followed, if they could be called separate days at all. Rain blurred the distinction between morning and afternoon, between activity and stillness. She sat more. She watched more. She stirred things slowly. Tea, soup, memory. She slept lightly, not because of restlessness, but because she no longer needed deep escape. The world around her wasn't pushing her away. It was inviting her to remain within it, entirely awake. Books remained unopened, letters unwritten. Lamps flickered gently in different rooms, as if passing messages between themselves. The mirror in the hallway no longer offered reflections, only the suggestion of movement, a shifting in the glass that felt like breath. The house didn't try to stay dry. It absorbed the moisture as it had absorbed memory, as it had absorbed silence, as it had absorbed her. Not in loss, in belonging. She placed bowls near the windowsills, not because of leaks, there were none, but because the sound of water falling into water felt like conversation. The bowls filled slowly, then stilled, like thoughts that no longer needed thinking, and she sat beside them, not waiting for the rain to stop, but welcoming it to continue. The rain continued, not in sheets or storms, but in patterns, long, fluid syllables spoken across shingles, whispered down gutters, tapped gently against glass. It was no longer weather. It was conversation. Each room received it differently. The kitchen caught it with a deep hum in the sink pipes, as though the walls there preferred their rhythms subterranean and slow. The hallway took it as a hush, wrapping the echoes of footsteps in velvet. Upstairs, the attic spoke back, its roof panels expanding and softening, wood sighing with every drop that landed above it. The woman began to hear the house differently. She could tell by tone and texture which room the rain preferred at any given moment. Sometimes it was the sitting room, where water struck the window pane in crisp staccato, as if asking to be let in. Other times it was the stairwell, where sound softened into a low thrum that resonated up through the banister and into her fingertips. She never responded aloud. She didn't need to. The house understood her quiet, and now, it seemed, she understood its. The key remained on the table, unmoved, yet when she passed it, it seemed to catch the rhythm of the rain, not visually, not physically, but sonically, as though the metal had learned to listen too, and now sat not in waiting, but in harmony. She touched it only once, not to lift, but to steady, and in that touch, the sound around her seemed to realign, as if the key had been tuning the entire room. By the third or fourth day, or perhaps the seventh, it no longer mattered. She began lighting different lamps in different rooms at different times, not out of need, but to shape the mood of each space as the rain shifted its voice. A yellow glow in the bedroom, a single candle in the attic, a dim hallway bulb that flickered like memory. Each light met the rain differently. None of them tried to overpower it. They simply coexisted, warmth beside water, flame beside mist. She ate small meals, bread, apples, soup, always near a window, never under direct light. The house, in turn, responded by softening every edge. The doorways no longer creaked. The corners seemed rounder. Even the cold in the floor faded. Not gone, but gentler, like a chill that knew it was allowed to stay without needing to announce itself. No one came. No letters arrived. No voices passed by the hill. But the woman did not feel isolated. She felt contained, held within the chorus of water, wood, and stillness. She stopped counting hours. She stopped preparing for clear skies. Not because she feared they wouldn't come, but because what she had, in that unchanging gray, was already enough. The rain deepened that night, not in violence but in volume. It pressed closer to the house, wrapped it more fully, not as an attack but as an embrace that forgot its own strength. The roof absorbed it without protest. The windows held. The chimney breathed slowly. Inside, the house grew quieter, not hushed, but reverent. The woman sat by the hearth, no fire lit, only a candle on the floor beside her, flickering with a kind of bravery. She had not spoken in days. She had not needed to. But that night she whispered a single word, not to herself, not to the house, not even to the rain, just into the room. And the room, instead of answering, listened. Then came the sound. Soft at first, so soft it was mistaken for wind through an open vent. But there were no open vents, no cracks in the walls. The sound was low, steady, round like breath but longer. And then, unmistakably, it became something else, a note. Just one. Long, sustained. It came from somewhere beneath the floor, or within the walls, or between the spaces where the house had folded time into silence. It was not electronic, not mechanical. It was the sound of something remembered too clearly to stay hidden. She rose slowly, the candle in hand, and followed the note. Not with urgency, but with recognition. Her steps took her through the kitchen, down the hallway, and finally to the room with the mirror. The sound was fuller here, richer, still singular, but now layered with an echo that did not belong to the rain. It wasn't music, not exactly, but it was not noise either. It was closer to tone, to memory, to a held breath that had finally begun to exhale. There had once been an instrument in the house, a harmonium, old and wooden, kept in the room beneath the stairs. No one had touched it in decades. No one had remembered it until now. Yet the sound, gently and unreasonably, came from that direction. She did not rush to find it. She sat down on the floor just outside that door and let the note surround her. It changed once, upward, slightly. Not a melody, just a shift, as if the house were clearing its throat. The rain continued, relentless, but not cruel, drumming the roof with a rhythm that now felt like accompaniment. The candle flickered sideways. The mirror, untouched, reflected nothing but shadow. And then the note faded, not cut off, not stopped, just let go, like breath returning to the body it came from. She closed her eyes, resting her palm against the floor. It was warm, not hot, not heated, just warm, like a memory that had finally forgiven itself. By the fourth night of rain, if such counting still applied, the house began to unfold. Not physically, not with noise or hinges, but in a way only those who had lived long enough to forget the difference between inside and outside could recognize. Doors that had never needed to open eased ajar without prompting. Drawers, long stuck in place by age and humidity, slid open half an inch as if to breathe. Fabrics released scents that had remained trapped for years. The faint vanilla of old letters, the dry musk of stored blankets, the brittle perfume of someone who had once stood very close but never returned. She noticed none of it at first. She was in the hallway, listening to the sound of the rain fall through the attic vents, reading it as one might read a poem with eyes closed. But the house was making decisions now. Gentle, non-invasive decisions about what it was ready to share. A floorboard beneath the bed in the upstairs room shifted with a subtle click. A corner panel in the kitchen wall released a puff of cooler air, scented faintly of tobacco and dried citrus. In the sitting room, behind the curtain she never touched, something heavy leaned forward in its frame. A painting, long covered, now tilting into view. The woman moved slowly as always, but her steps had changed. They no longer touched the floor with hesitation. They pressed gently, with expectation, as though she knew the house might respond at any moment. When she opened the drawer in the hall table and found a ribbon, sun-faded, worn at the edge, tied in a knot that no longer held anything, she didn't ask where it had come from. She only touched it to her palm, then placed it near the key beside the photograph and the stone. It wasn't an altar. It was a gathering, a quiet assembly of things that knew one another without having to explain why. The house offered more, but she didn't take everything. A cupboard door hung open by an inch. She left it that way. A book fell from a shelf in the attic and landed face down on the floor. She placed it back without checking the page. The house was not recounting events. It was remembering presence. And she, in return, was not archiving. She was simply listening. That night, she didn't light a fire. She sat with the rain, with the ribbon, with the scent of old citrus in the air, with the gentle shift of a house no longer trying to be strong, but willing to be known. And when she closed her eyes, it wasn't to sleep. It was to let herself be remembered too. The rain stopped during the night, though no one could say when. There was no final crescendo, no tapering into mist. One moment, the house breathed alongside it. The next, the rhythm had vanished. What remained was not silence, but aftermath. A hush so full it felt like a room that had just been exhaled. The roof held still. The windows no longer trembled. The walls, swollen with sound for days, now leaned gently inward, as though checking their own weight in the absence of pressure. She woke before the light did, not from a sound, but from the lack of it. Something in her bones had grown used to the rain's companionship. The stillness now pressed differently against her skin, not cold, not empty, just more open. She rose slowly, wrapped in a blanket, and stepped through the hallway without a lamp. The air smelled of wet wood, linen, and something clean, something unplaceable, like an untouched room that had remembered to breathe on its own. The mirror in the hallway offered her reflection more clearly than usual, as if moisture had finally wiped away its film. She didn't stop to look. She didn't need to. Her reflection followed her anyway, in the sheen on the floorboards, in the shape she left in the folds of the curtain, in the weight she no longer carried in her shoulders. She stepped outside without shoes. The porch was damp, but not slick. The wood beneath her feet gave slightly, not with rot, but with memory. The hill below glistened, water pooled in crevices where no path remained. The whispering tree stood straighter, its branches still heavy, but no longer bowed. Everything shimmered in the pale gray of almost morning. Nothing moved, and yet everything had. She sat on the steps, the blanket trailing behind her, and listened, not for return, not for meaning, just for what was left. Somewhere, deep within the walls behind her, the house adjusted. A slow exhale, a hinge released, a breath drawn without effort. There would be no recounting, no summary. The rain had done its work, and in its absence what remained was more than memory. It was shape. It was evidence. She closed her eyes and felt the wind brush against her arms. The world had returned, but not completely. It had left just enough room for her and the house to remain as they were. No longer behind, no longer waiting, just still. And when she opened her eyes again, the road was still invisible, but it no longer needed to be seen. She had become its ending, and the house, its quiet destination. That day passed without reference. No clock marked its hours. No sequence of meals or lamps lit or windows opened separated morning from evening. The house and the woman moved through time like water through cloth, slow, seamless, without resistance. Nothing was done for a reason, yet nothing was accidental. She swept the floor without noticing she had stood up. She opened a drawer, then closed it again, not because she was looking for anything, but because the movement belonged to the rhythm of the day. The key, the ribbon, the stone, and the photograph remained where they were. She no longer arranged them, no longer checked their position. They had become part of the room's structure, like light on a wall or air in a hallway. The house didn't hold them as relics. It held them as it now held her, without question, without tension. She found herself humming again, barely audible, more breath than note. The tune had no origin, but it curved through the rooms and settled into corners like warmth. The harmonium in the back room did not sound again. It didn't need to. Its note, once released, had done what it came to do. There was nothing left to awaken, only things to dwell. When evening came, she lit the fire, not because it was cold, but because the act of lighting it completed something. The flame caught easily, as if it had never forgotten how to rise. She sat near it, blanket over her knees, her hand resting on the arm of the chair, with the ease of someone who had forgotten she was ever new to the place. Outside, the world returned to its own patterns. The wind moved more freely. The birds came back. Somewhere down the hill, a dog barked once, and the sound did not disturb the stillness. It joined it. She fell asleep without ceremony, still in the chair, the fire soft behind her. The house did not quiet to accommodate her rest. It simply continued. A floorboard released pressure. A door eased shut in another room. A draft moved through the hallway and kissed the edges of the mirror, which now reflected only light and shadow, no longer in search of form. By the time the fire had gone out and the stars had completed their slow arc above the roof, the line between her and the house had vanished. There were still walls, still windows, still separate rooms, but no separation, not of presence, not of purpose. And in the softest part of the night, when everything that could be said had been lived instead, the house, the woman, the silence, and the space between all things held one another the way old hands sometimes do, not for reassurance, not for comfort, but simply because they can. The morning came slowly, as if reluctant to separate itself from the night. Light arrived not in beams but in gradients, coloring the edges of things rather than revealing them. The house received it without blinking, as though it had already expected this particular softness. The woman stirred in her chair near the hearth, the fire long gone, but its warmth still nested in the air. She did not rush to rise. Her body moved with the same rhythm as the dust dancing in the light, unhurried, unconcerned with direction. She walked the rooms without thought. Her feet knew where not to step. Her hand knew which door needed gentleness and which would open with weight. Nothing creaked. Not because the house had grown younger, but because it had grown used to being inhabited again. Not with motion, but with awareness. The walls had adjusted their posture to her presence, and she had stopped wondering what they used to mean. In the small room, the photograph remained. The key, the ribbon, the stone, all untouched. They no longer marked a past. They marked a middle, a place between beginnings and endings, a place where things simply are. She didn't look at them this time. She didn't need to. She felt them, as one feels a familiar scent on clothing or a remembered voice in the quiet of a room. She opened no windows that day, not out of fatigue, but because nothing needed to be let in or let out. The air inside the house had found its balance, and so had she. Even the tree outside, once so full of gestures, of whispering leaves and restless limbs, stood more still now, not stiff, not silent, just present, as if it, too, had reached the point where movement no longer signaled change. When she sat again, it was not to rest. It was to remain. She folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes, not to escape inward, but to extend outward, to become part of the room's contours, part of the color of its quiet. The house did not hum, did not respond, did not hold its breath. It simply adjusted, subtly, imperceptibly, to include her more deeply in its structure. She was not a guest, not a keeper. She was something the house had always known it would one day become. The sun passed overhead without declaring itself. Shadows shifted, then faded. Afternoon came and went, like a thought half remembered, and by the time dusk returned, the house had stopped noticing where the day ended and the evening began. There was only presence, only the ongoingness of being, not forward, not backward, not paused. She did not plan her movements that day. They emerged from her as naturally as the creak of a floorboard or the settling of air near a window. She filled a glass of water and left it half drunk on the sill. She swept a corner, not because it was dusty, but because the broom was nearby. Her body moved with the grace of someone who had nothing to finish. The house noticed, not with response but with stillness. A curtain shifted in a room she hadn't entered. The mirror grew dimmer, though the light had not changed. Even the firewood stacked neatly by the hearth seemed to soften its edges. That afternoon she sat in the attic with her back against the wall. The heat had faded. The dust no longer floated. It rested. Around her were boxes she had never opened. She had no desire to know what they held. What mattered was that they had been held, and that she could now be among them without needing to name anything. The walls there no longer held echoes. They held silence, layered and generous, a silence that didn't ask to be broken, only shared. The rain had not returned. The sky remained overcast, but the light was even. The windows no longer carried reflections. They became part of the walls, part of the way the house saw inward instead of out. And when she descended the stairs again, she moved more slowly, not out of caution, but in rhythm. The house breathed with her, each step a sentence, each room a pause. That night she didn't light a lamp. She didn't need to. She moved through the dark as if it were another version of light. The key, the ribbon, the photograph, and the stone remained untouched, and yet they felt closer now. They no longer sat atop the desk. They were part of its weight. On the 6th morning, she awoke before the sun and walked to the front porch. The hill was misted over, not with fog, but with the kind of light that makes outlines uncertain and shapes gentler. She sat without a blanket, without tea, without expectation. The tree beside the porch didn't move. It simply stood beside her, old and present. She rested her hand on the wood of the step, fingers spread flat, palm pressing into grain. And for a long time she said nothing, did nothing, but felt herself held from underneath. A bird landed near her, not close enough to touch, but close enough to know. It looked once toward the house and once toward the slope. Then it flew, not up, Not away, just forward. She watched it until it disappeared behind the thick line of trees. She didn't follow with her eyes. She didn't turn her head. She just remained. Still. Anchored. Later, inside, she swept the hearth without needing to light a fire. She rearranged nothing. She changed nothing. But the objects in the room shifted slightly. The chair angled itself more fully toward the window. A book leaned forward on a shelf. The door to the back room, the one with the harmonium, no longer needed to be closed. It hung open with the calm of something long reconciled. That evening, she whispered again, this time into the stairwell. Not a word, not a thought. Just sound, shaped by memory. The house did not reply. It didn't need to. She had begun speaking in its language. And the house, always fluent in what was left unspoken, listened with every grain of its frame. Time no longer arranged itself in rows. There were no mornings, no evenings, no sense of before or after, only light and absence of light, only movement and the choice to be still. The house had shed its orientation. It no longer faced the past, nor the slope, nor even her. It simply existed, like breath without lungs, like presence without form. She moved from room to room with the same care she once reserved for prayer, not with reverence for what had come before, but for what was still here. The walls did not remember anymore. They welcomed. The floors did not tell stories. They offered rest. The ceiling no longer hung above her like a question. It became sky. She lit a candle once, not because she needed light, but because she had forgotten what flame looked like. Its flicker surprised her, not because it danced, but because it reminded her that movement could still be small and alive. She watched it until it stopped being something she watched and became part of her stillness. Outside, the slope remained. The fence remained. The tree remained. But their outlines had faded into a softness the world no longer interrupted. She stood at the window and pressed her hand against the glass, not to reach out, but to know the barrier was no longer necessary. The house had no need to hold her in place. She had chosen to remain. That night, the sky cleared for the first time in many days. Stars revealed themselves without ceremony, without arrangement, just scattered light across scattered dark. She stepped outside once more, barefoot on the damp wood, and tilted her head toward the sky, not to see, but to feel. The stars did not answer her. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. She sat at the top of the steps, knees drawn to her chest, and closed her eyes. The wind touched her face. A soft creak sounded behind her, not of warning, but of something settling into peace. The house did not reach for her. It did not ask anything of her. It simply held its shape around the space she had chosen to occupy. They had become each other's outline. And when she stood at last, she did not go back inside. She simply turned, laid her hand once more on the porch beam, and leaned forward slightly, just enough for the house to feel it, just enough to say, "We are still here." The next morning arrived like mist, already present before it was seen. The house made no noise. The woman did not rise immediately. Neither moved first. But together they began the day without beginning it. She walked into the hallway and paused where the mirror had always hung. It was no longer there, not removed, not fallen, just no longer needed. She smiled, not with lips, but with breath, with presence. The house, without windows open, let in the light anyway. It had stopped separating itself from the world, and she had stopped guarding herself from the house. She did not pack, did not tidy, did not close a chapter. She simply walked through each room one more time, not to say goodbye, not to take anything in, but to leave her shape behind, like a warm indentation in a well-used chair. When she finally stepped outside and the door eased closed behind her, there was no change in the air, no sound to mark a departure, because there wasn't one. The house still stood, the hill still sloped, the tree still whispered, and somewhere inside the walls, her breath still lingered, in the grain of the wood, in the bend of the stair, in the quiet that no longer waited to be broken. The house had never faced the wrong way. It had only been waiting for someone who no longer needed direction. And now it faced everything, It faced being.